morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, April 27th, 2020. Today we're talking about federalism, the 10th Amendment as a tool to advance liberty. To be used, now tools, of course, don't generally activate themselves, so to be used to prevent what the founders called consolidation or centralization of power, and even as an outgrowth of that, the dangers of what they referred to as factions, or what we could call today the modern two-party political party system. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We've got a bunch of platforms. We're on both video and audio. We live stream on video through YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Periscope, and Twitch. Hopefully we'll add some more in the near future. I applied to be able to do it on LinkedIn as well. We have archive video versions at Brighteon.com, BitChute, BitTube, and Library, and then audio-only podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, and elsewhere. You can find all of those platforms, all of the archives of the show notes for each episode where I link to important stuff that I'm talking about. So I've got a bunch of articles and letters from founders and things like that I'll be covering today. I will include that in the show notes. That's all at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty. And on that homepage for this show, you'll also find ways to follow us, like our social media platforms, our email newsletter, plus our membership program. You can support us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I want to say hello to everyone out in the live chat before digging in on the great info today. Hi to Liberty Howell, that's an awesome name, Too Tall 509, MRGF, Patricia Dance, Dan Reed, Michael Bogus, Jim Rayner, Michael Lure, Melody Skaman, lots of Michaels, good name, I'm a little partial, Andrew Nappy, Essential Freedom, Justin Bayola, and everyone else I appreciate. Jim Rayner as well. He says his profile's banned. I'm not sure. I see your chat here, but we only get icons based on the platform you're on Facebook, so I'm not sure why it's not showing up. But I appreciate you guys all joining me here today. I hope you had a good weekend, as good as can be under the circumstances. But let's get into this. I want to start out with a quote from Thomas Jefferson that I think sums up a lot of my views as well, and a lot of the structure of the entire Constitution. Now, if you've watched some of these other episodes I've done on the 10th Amendment, I've done, I think, 3 now. This would be the 4th, and you can find them all. I'll link to it in the show notes. We've got kind of a resource page on the 10th Amendment where you get a bunch of articles and videos and things like that. But he talked about the 10th Amendment as the foundation of the Constitution. Why? Well, and he summed it up in this other quote that I have here. He says, "Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government." This is a time, I believe there are 14 states at the time that he made this, wrote this letter. Too large. He recognized, like so many of the other founders, George Mason, Patrick Henry, many others, they recognize that when you centralize power, you're going to screw up a lot. And when you screw up on a centralized system, we would call it, for example, in a networking situation, a single point of failure. When you have one point of failure and you make an error, or you do something wrong, or you harm people, you harm everyone. Instead of you have a distributed system or a decentralized system that was set up under the Constitution, that means errors are limited in its size, scope, and geographic area. And that's how Jefferson put it. Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government. And this is the full quote. It was a letter to Gideon Granger in the ramp up to the election of 1800, which started sometime in October. Jefferson came in number 2 in the previous election to John Adams and was the vice president. They were going head to head again. It was a very close race. And he says, again, too large to have its affairs directed by a single government. Why? Public servants at such a distance, Jefferson wrote, and from under the eye of their constituents will, from the circumstance of distance, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizen. Now, to Jefferson, good government didn't always mean government doing things, government bailing people out, government protecting people. A lot of times good government meant doing nothing, staying the heck out of the way, not being involved in certain issues. But we all know that what's right for California may not be right for New York or for Oklahoma and vice versa. And that's why these regional differences can only be respected in a federal system as codified in law under the Constitution by the 10th Amendment. He goes on. And the same circumstance, I should read through that again. He says, they will, from the circumstance of distance, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizen. And the same circumstance, by rendering detection impossible to their constituents, will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. Not only was he describing the need for decentralization, for a distributed system, for federalism, for the 10th Amendment. Not only was he describing the need for it, he was being prophetic. He knew that if centralized power was to rule the day, like we see today, we would have corruption, plunder, and waste. And ladies and gentlemen, I think we definitely have a trifecta. But I want to go a little further into this, dig a little further. And for that, I want to go back to an article by our friend at the TAC, a great friend of the TAC, Brian McClanahan, who also does an awesome podcast. He's been covering issues of federalism for many, many years. And this was an article that he wrote all the way back in May of 2009, something that was originally published over at LouRockwell.com that we reposted here at the TAC over a decade ago. And I think it's just as applicable today, although the teams that he references changes a little bit today. Check this out. He says the recent rejuvenation of interest in states' rights, nullification, and secession has been a welcome result of the explosion of federal power since the housing and credit bubbles burst last fall. The 10th Amendment movements and Tea Parties are, at least on one level, a pure form of republicanism. That's what the founders considered federalism. The true Federalists were they called them Democratic Republicans. He goes on, unfortunately, there are those who call themselves Republicans who have little understanding about the history of the Republic, namely how the founding generation conceptualized the United States as Jefferson called it in the Declaration of Independence. He says simply rallying against unconstitutional taxes, expansive federal programs, and again, the names may change, but the actions are pretty much the same. They're just different people doing it. Simply rallying against unconstitutional taxes, expansive federal programs, or shallow assaults on the Democrats and Obama is not enough. You can chant about the 10th Amendment till you go hoarse. We hear a lot of people chanting about it today, but we know they're not true believers. They only use it when it fits their political narrative. And I think the same thing was going on under the previous administration as well. You can chant about it till you go hoarse, but without understanding the principles behind state sovereignty, your voice will be useless. And if you listened to my episode last Friday, I talked about sovereignty, the evolution of sovereignty in political thought. When we talk about state sovereignty, sovereignty means final authority in the American system, and we don't mean sovereignty in the state governments, but states as representing the peoples of the several states. He says, so without understanding the principles behind it, your voice is useless. And I think that has really played out since 2009 because the people who were really calling for the 10th Amendment, for resistance to centralized power, a lot of those same people now are on the centralized power bandwagon, and the people who were for the centralized power are now, again, just like the others, pretending to be for decentralization. It just flips and flops and back and forth. I do think honest people, some honest people out there, recognize that this is happening and get pretty disgusted with all of them. But going a little further, this is how Mike Meharry summed it up in a blog that we're going to be running, it looks like probably tomorrow. He says, South Dakota is different than New York. Duh, right? So why would we expect New York policies to be appropriate for South Dakota? And vice versa, for that matter, too. But when all government flows from Washington, D.C., and this is what Jefferson warned about, you centralize all of your cares into one area, you're going to have major problems. He says that's exactly what we get. One size fits all policy dictated from on high that may or may not be effective in a given region. And mind you, they don't really even care as much about whether it's effective when it's centralized because they can't really drill down into the needs of what someone in New York City may be experiencing versus someone in Boise, Idaho, for example. It's so different. And rather than allowing those people to just make those decisions in those areas on basically everything, other than the powers delegated to the federal government, there's 30 to 35 of them throughout the document. Article 1, Section 8 is the largest reservoir of them. You can count those at 17 or 18 powers in Article 1, Section 8. There's not much stuff. James Madison, as I say over and over, in Federalist 45, told us that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution, this was in Federalist Papers while the Constitution was still being debated for ratification, by the proposed Constitution delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. Again, the people of the states determine how they're going to delegate powers to various levels of government. So one-size-fits-all solutions are never solutions. They're generally just politically motivated. What can get you the most votes? What can get you the most support? What can get you the most financial backers? What is going to make you look best in the polls? That's really all that matters. What can get you the most media attention? And it really is very little about doing the right thing. You can't. It's just impossible. And that's why Jefferson said it's too large. The country is too large. It's not possible to direct the affairs of the entire country in a single government. And that was at a time when the country was so much smaller than it is today. Although technology changes things, but still, I think Jefferson, his prophetic vision, his view of this, really, it applies so well today as well, even if not better. Now, he was far from alone, of course. And here's Roger Sherman in the Philadelphia Convention. I think it was in July. I don't want to scroll too much here. He says each state, and this he's explaining why. And Sherman was kind of a big government guy at the time. He was one of the people that was kind of in Hamilton's camp. James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, these were the big government people. And even he was recognizing that each state had different views of things. They had different approaches. There's so many religious, political, and economic viewpoints in this country. You can't have today 300 plus million people with so many different views living in one nation in peace unless they're allowed to have their own ways in their own area. He says each state, like each individual, this is in the summer of 1787, Roger Sherman, each state, like each individual, had its peculiar habits, usages, and manners, which constituted its happiness. It would not therefore give to others a power over this happiness any more than an individual would do when he could avoid it. And going back to Brian McClanahan, he says, in other words, a republic is only plausible over a small distance, a small geographic area. And in fact, Jefferson later, in his later years, he was looking at the New England towns as great examples where they had direct democracy in these small cities. He was talking about them as being mini republics, as maybe the ideal, real small. And for those of you who are into the Mises Institute, there's a great paper done by Hans Hermann Hoppe, a speech that he gave in 1997, talking about basically the way to fight the modern state, the largest government in the history of the world, is to focus your efforts on basically returning to small city-states. In essence, his view was talking about like 1,000 independent cities around the country, for example. Whether that's de facto or in law, I think the end result is the same. But this type of thought process has gone on for generations and generations. So McClanahan says a republic is only plausible over a small distance. Anything beyond that would destroy the ability of the people to control the government, and that is the foundation of republicanism. Now, that doesn't mean that local governments are good guys or state governments are good guys. All governments at every level are all evil. It's the nature of power that power will always grow. Power will always try to attack your liberty. But the notion that Jefferson and Sherman and so many others, and I'll get to George Mason in a little bit as well, what they are recognizing is that power does grow. Power will always corrupt. Power will always expand. And so therefore, the way to actually fight against that and give liberty a chance is to limit the area where power can have an impact. Again, a single point of failure versus a distributed system. And that's how McClanahan sums it up here as well. He says, to the founders, diffusing power over large groups of people and then placing it in a small number of representatives violated the principle of direct control of the government. And more importantly, the founders understood that the states stood against a hedge against factionalism. So they knew that when you centralize power, you would have a real danger of factionalism. And factionalism is what they use to basically describe what we could see as today's two-party system. You have one faction going one way and one faction going the other way. I mean, a lot of times the end policy results are very similar, but it's really this kind of low-grade civil war every few years of one side trying to control the other side, to defeat the other, to eliminate the other, so they can control the entire system. And again, centralized power is what causes that. And George Washington warned us about this as well, this factionalism through consolidated power, in his famous farewell address in 1796. And he put it this way: the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge. Of course, this is, I mean, anyone watching this stuff in any of recent years knows that a lot of times that's exactly what they do. One team is out of power and they don't like how they're treated, so once they get back, they act in a spirit of revenge. And it doesn't have liberty as its goal. It's just more centralization of power and control. Well, if you did this, then we're going to do this. We're going to do this other thing that you hate. And then it just becomes one after another after another. And this is what we were warned about. He says, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. The alternate domination of one faction over another is a frightful despotism in and of itself. It's a tyranny. And Washington goes further. He says this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. You may have it for a while, but if you allow it to continue, centralization of power, consolidation, an outgrowth of that is factionalism. And that factionalism leads to a permanent tyranny, a permanent despotism. He says the disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Again, Washington's farewell address was originally drafted by James Madison. I don't know. I'm not an expert enough in that address to know how much of this was James Madison. I'm sure there's some historian who knows which draft was which, but originally drafted by James Madison, who was on the opposing side after ratification from, he was more with Jefferson, John Taylor, and others rather than with Hamilton and Washington. So, but he still worked. They all worked together, certainly. Written by James Madison and finalized by George Washington, tells that this leads to the ruin of public liberty. And if we're not there yet, even though you and I are still connected here today, it doesn't mean that they don't have the power to shut it off. I mean, I just don't think that they're fully there yet, but they certainly have. They've certainly set up the capabilities. And all they need is more fear-mongering, and people will willingly submit to more and more power. We've seen this throughout the ages. John Adams was another one who talked about this consolidation of power divided by two parties. And he put it this way in a letter in 1880. It was to Jonathan Jackson, October 1880, or 1780, I'm sorry. He says, "There is nothing I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader, and concerting measures in opposition to each other." This is almost 2 decades before Washington had to say it, before Madison drafted it in 1792. That was 12 years before Madison drafted it. Same concept. I know that the founders, it's really bad to say the founders thought such and such, because there's a lot of individuals, a lot of different backgrounds. A Richard Henry Lee from an from kind of an aristocracy, I can't even say the word, aristocracy. His background was great friends with Samuel Adams, who was a people's person, relatively poor, didn't come from rich, but they became great friends. But that was more unusual. There was a lot of differences in background, religious views, economic views, and thought, but they had certain things where they were very, very consistent. And one of them was opposing consolidation of power. Another was this domination of factions. James Madison talked about factions in Federalist 10 as well, but it's very consistent over the years. And again, he says, there's nothing I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader, and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution. We've got no greater proof than John Adams himself, because once he became president, once he became a leader of one of those factions, he exemplified what he warned about better than many others. He may have been one of the greatest examples of this in the late 1790s when he pushed for, supported, and signed the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which, of course, we know James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Taylor, and many others were so vehemently opposed to. Going a little bit further, this is a surprising thing for me. I rarely cite the Supreme Court, especially modern Supreme Court precedent, Supreme Court cases, but I've done some episodes and we base a lot of our strategy on what is supported by the anti-commandeering doctrine, this notion that the federal government can't compel the states or local communities to use resources or manpower in any way to help implement or enforce federal regulatory programs. And here from the 1992 case, this is Sandra Day OConnor. This is pretty surprising to me how good this is. She writes, the Constitution does not protect the sovereignty of states for the benefit of the states or state governments as abstract political entities, or even for the benefit of the public officials governing the states. To the contrary, the Constitution divides authority between federal and state governments for the protection of individuals. That's not something you normally hear from Supreme Court justices in my lifetime, at least. The goal is to protect individuals. Now, maybe her view of what protecting means is different, but I think it was, well, hear the rest of it. She said, state sovereignty is not just an end in itself. Rather, federalism secures to citizens the liberties that derive from the diffusion of sovereign power. There's some technical errors that I would disagree with on that, but the goal, what she's talking about here, is that federalism exists. The 10th Amendment exists. The fact that the federal government doesn't have total authority over anything and anything that they want, general welfare, necessary and proper, regulating commerce. This does not mean whatever we want. And she's acknowledging that the reason that this exists is not just to empower state governments, kind of like what Hamilton said in Federalist 32. He suggested this was to protect state governments. But really, it's a tool to advance liberty. You decentralize, the federal system allows liberty a chance. Because again, when errors are made, when liberty is attacked, it's limited in its size, scope, and geographic area. Now, a lot of people think we should ignore federalism as long as there's a good short-term outcome. And Mike Meharry has done a lot of great work on this. I just want to cover one brief piece on this. In fact, I probably should do a full episode on it at some point. What do you do when centralized power seems to help liberty? And Mike has made the case many times, and I should probably start doing this as well, that even if you have a good short-term outcome, the precedent that you set by centralizing power means someone in the future is going to use that centralized power to attack liberty. So your short-term win is really just fleeting. He says the mistake libertarian centralizers, and I think he was talking about the head of the Libertarian Party in this article, Nick Sarwark. He says the mistake libertarian centralizers make is that they think they can control federal power for their own ends to advance liberty. I don't know who thinks that, but it seems to be that way. I can't get into the head of some people. He says, but the real danger is in the power itself. Once you accept the legitimacy of using government power to advance an end, you can't put it back in the box. And when others control it, Mike writes, it will eventually be used against you. This is the old notion, the old Lord Acton quote of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Many of the founders made statements very similar to that. Samuel Adams, for example, or here, George Mason, again in the Philadelphia Convention, summer of 1787, it looks like July 11th. He says, "From the nature of man, we may be sure that those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. On the contrary," again, George Mason, "on the contrary, we know they will always, when they can, rather increase it." He didn't say sometimes, once in a while, when it's advantageous. He said when they have an opportunity, people will with power will always increase it. And that's why Mason and so many others were so adamant in their opposition to consolidation, centralization of power, because that is what is the death knell of liberty. And back to that original letter to Gideon Granger that Thomas Jefferson wrote in August of 1800, before that big election against John Adams. He summed it up this way. He says, "I do verily believe that if the principle were to prevail of a common law being enforced in the U.S., which principle possesses the general government at once of all the powers of the state governments and reduces us to a single consolidated government." So I'll just sum that up because it's pretty convoluted. He says, if everything, all cares, were in a single government, which is pretty close to how things are today, he says, it would become the most corrupt government on the face of the earth. The most corrupt government on the face of the earth. Centralization of power is the problem. It is not the solution. Looking over at the live chat, just checking to see if there's some interesting quotes and questions on here, to see if there's anything I can answer. Things like, what about power connected to wealth? Well, I think that's from Anomalia Nicole Chrysalis Nix. I apologize if I get that wrong. Anomalia. It's a cool name, cool name. I appreciate your question. What about power connected to wealth? Well, generally, so for example, a lot of people talk about corruption in elections, for example. There's too much money in politics. Well, the reason for that is because there's too much power in one place. If you're talking about trying to manipulate elections or manipulate and lobby through wealth and influence and power, the reason that that's so effective is because that central government, that supposedly general government, which is now a central, no longer really a federal government, is because it's involved in everything. And the more things that it's involved with, the more things that people with power, money, and influence will try to influence it to do things that they want. So it just creates this endless cycle. And I think this is kind of a chicken versus the egg situation. What created the situation? I think it really is the consolidation first, which attracts the people to control that power. But you could make the case the other way around. The end result is really, really the same. She also says, or he says, Americans love political binary factions. Absolutely. And just seeing, I'm going to probably look through the chat a little bit more later today. Deference to government authority is going the way of the priest, says Frank. And Dan Reed, replying to yourself, after 200 years of a government abided by the Constitution, and now the officials want to abolish some of those rules that interrupt their agenda. I don't think the federal government followed the Constitution for very long at all. That might make its own great episode. That's from Robert over on Facebook. And Dan Reed here, this is the question I wanted to, or the comment I wanted to check on. Dan says, one of the biggest challenges we face is countering the indoctrination in colleges and high schools that even the idea of the 10th Amendment is anathema to the general government, which of course is idiocy, but try to explain that to a dug-in sycophant. Well, and that is a huge problem. And I, for most of my life, was one of those dug-in sycophants. I believe that every problem required a central government solution. And for those of you who've heard me talk about this before, I apologize. But basically, I remember one of the airline bailouts, probably sometime in the 80s when I was a kid. I graduated high school in 1990. And my initial thought while I was in government school was, if they're going to bail out the airlines, why don't they just own them? The government should just own them. I remember Dennis Kucinich, some years after that, was talking about the government should own the baseball stadiums. They should, if they're going to build a baseball stadium, the government should own it, deal with the ticketing and everything. And this was just a natural, logical view in my screwed up head at the time, because I had been taught through these government indoctrination systems, these schools, that every problem required a centralized solution. And so, Dan, you're absolutely right. This is a massive uphill battle. We're also talking about facing down the largest government in the history of the world. This type of thing isn't going to change from one podcast, one YouTube, one gotcha, one meme, one anything. I think it's incumbent on those of us who believe in liberty to continue promoting it, no matter how great the odds are against us, no matter how much it's stacked against us, and whether we can achieve liberty in our lifetime or set the foundation for a future generation to have liberty in their lifetime. I believe that's what we morally really must do at all turns. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it educational. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I hope you learned something. If you support liberty, you support the Constitution, you support the work that we do here at the TAC, if you consume my content regularly, whether here on video or if you listen to other shows that we host on the site, Mike Meharry has a podcast. We've done a lot of videos from Dave Benner. Or if you just read our articles, there's over 10,000 of them on our website. We make it all available for free, but it would mean the world to me if you would consider a membership. They start as little as $2 a month, and you can get that set up over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do see a number of people out here who are members of the TAC, have been either short or a long time. I really, really appreciate your support. But if you can't pitch in financially, I know it's a struggle for a lot of people these days, please don't feel obligated. I'm just asking because that's my job, of course. I'm asking for the support if you're able to do it. If not, and you want to help us out free, you can do a number of things. You can hit a like button on whatever platform you're on, leave comments in the archive, subscribe, reviews on iTunes or other podcast platforms. All of those free actions, very simple, takes a few seconds. They tell the algorithm of the platform you're watching or listening on to show the program to more people. So that really helps a lot. I've seen a lot of that come in. It's really ramped up recently, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for you spending time with me today. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope you are as safe, as healthy, as happy, and as stocked up as can be. And we're going to continue setting the foundation for more liberty in the future. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.